Today I'm going to show you how to work an alternating mini puff stitch. And to begin this textured stitch, you need to have a foundation row in an odd number that you can build off of. So for the sample that I'm going to work off of for the tutorial today, I have 17 single crochets. So that's going to be your foundation row is 17. You can have a foundation row of half double crochets, double crochets, any stitch you want, but I do have a single crochets for the sake of showing you the stitch combination today. So to begin, you're going to do your chain one and turn for your first row. Now you're going to work a single crochet in that first stitch. In the next stitch, you're going to work a mini puff. To work a mini puff, you're going to yarn over, insert your hook, and pull up a loop. Now you're going to yarn over again, insert your hook, and pull up a loop. I now have 5 loops on my hook. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yarn over and pull through all 5 loops on your hook to complete that first mini puff. Now chain 1, skip a stitch, and work another mini puff in the next stitch. So yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert your hook into the same stitch, pull up a loop, 5 loops on your hook, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yarn over, and pull through all 5 loops on your hook to complete that puff stitch. So our second puff stitch is completed. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, and a mini puff in the next stitch. We're going to repeat this all the way across the row. Chain 1, mini puff. Chain 1, skip 1, and another mini puff stitch. Chain 1, skip 1, mini puff. Chain 1, skip 1, mini puff stitch. Chain 1, skip 1, a mini puff stitch. Okay, I've completed that mini puff stitch and there's only 1 stitch left. In that last stitch, work a single crochet, and row 1 has been completed. So I started with 17 single crochets, and now I should have 8 mini puff stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 7 chain spaces. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then of course we began and we ended with a single crochet. So to begin the next row, we're going to chain our 1 and turn. And again, you will always begin your row with a single crochet. For the second row, you're going to chain 1, and now you're going to drop down and work into this skipped stitch of the first row, and you're going to work a mini puff. So yarn over, drop down, go into that skipped stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, go back into that same stitch, pull up a loop, 5 loops on your hook, yarn over, and pull through all 5 to complete. Now you're going to chain 1, and now come over and work into this skipped stitch from the row below and work a mini puff. And now chain 1, and then a mini puff into the next stitch. Chain 1. We're going to repeat this. Chain 1, you'll skip the puff stitch and then come across and work into that skipped stitch. We're going to repeat all the way to the last chain space here, where we'll work another mini puff. Okay, I'm at the end of my second row here. So I've worked a mini puff, I've chained 1. We're going to skip this puff stitch, work a mini puff in that skipped stitch from 1 row below. Okay, and there's a puff stitch here, so we're going to chain 1. We're going to skip this puff stitch right here and work a single crochet in the top of that last stitch of that row. and that is the completion of row 2. So if you look closely at row 2, you're going to have 8 chain spaces. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we'll have 7 puff stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And this is going to be our repeat. We're going to repeat basically the first row where you get 8 puff stitches and 7 chain spaces. And then the next row will be 7 puff stitches and 8 chain spaces. Okay, so we're going to chain 1 and turn and begin row 3. So again, start with that single crochet in your first stitch. Now the first stitch after the first couple rows is a little bit tricky. You got to drop down and look at this first row of puff stitches, and you can see the puff stitch right here, and here's your single crochet, and right here is your space. That's where you're going to work that puff stitch. So yarn over, drop down, and work into that space between those stitches and work your mini puff stitch. And chain 1, you're going to skip the puff stitch from that row below. You're going to come down. Here's your puff stitch, and if you pull it aside, you can see right here is the space, that's this chain space from row 1. You're going to work another puff stitch in there. So yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop, pull through all 5 loops on your hook, and chain 1 and skip the next puff stitch. Okay, so we're skipping that next puff stitch. We're going to drop down. Here's your puff from the 2 rows below, and you're going to work into the space between. So pull those apart, and you can see there's your chain space. Yarn over, insert your hook into that chain space, and work your mini puff stitch. And chain 1. Skip the current row's puff stitch, come down and grab that chain space from the first row of puff stitches. These are a little tricky to identify at first, but once you get used to them, they become easier and easier to find with just your hook. So I chained 1. We're going to skip this puff stitch. Again, drop down and find that chain space from the row below and work your mini puff stitch there. And chain 1, skip the current row's puff stitch, find the puff stitch from the row below, and there is your chain space, and work into there. Chain 1, skip the current row's puff stitch, here's your puff stitch. Usually if you just slip your hook in right on the side of it, it's going to be right into that chain space right there. Okay, one more, so chain 1, here's your puff stitch, here's the first one from the first row. You can kind of pull that apart and see it, yarn over, insert your hook, work that puff stitch, and then you're going to work a single crochet in that last stitch of the row. Okay, so you just completed your 3rd row. You're going to have 8 puff stitches. So you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you'll have your 7 chain spaces. If you put this down, you can see it a little bit easier. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so now you're going to chain 1 and turn, and now you're going to begin your 4th row of the mini puff stitches. So again, start with that single crochet. You're going to chain 1 and skip 1. Now it's the same thing. You're going to drop down, find that puff stitch from 2 rows down. So this is your 1st row down, this is your 2nd row down. Here's the puff. If you pull those apart, you can find that chain space right there. Yarn over, insert your hook, and work a mini puff. Chain 1, skip the current row's puff stitch, work into that chain space before the puff stitch in the prior row. So here's the puff stitch, pull it apart, and you can find that chain space right there. and work your mini puff. Whoops. Chain one, skip one. And again, once you get used to this, you can usually just put your hook down there on the side of the puff and it just kind of slides right into that chain space. And puff, mini puff stitch, chain one, skip one, mini puff, chain one, work, skip one, mini puff into that chain space from 2 rows below, and chain one. We're going to continue this all the way across the row. Okay, so this is 4 rows of the alternating mini puff stitch worked. Just continue to repeat these rows over and over. It's basically going to be a repeat of rows 3 and 4, and then I'll come back and kind of show you what that looks like after more rows have been worked. Okay, so now I've worked multiple rows of the alternating mini puff stitch. It's a very pretty texture with a lot of visual interest in it. I love this stitch. I want to show you how to work your last row. So depending on what you're making, you've worked up however many rows you need. And as you can see, there's like these little open spaces from your chain one spaces. So on the next row, we're actually going to close that off so it has a nice clean look, just like the way your pattern started. So to do that, you've ended this row just like normal. I actually ended on a row that only has 7 puff stitches. So it started with a chain space. You can use this technique on either row that you end on. I'm just going to show you how to, like I said, fill in those spaces there. So you're going to chain one, you're going to turn to begin that last row. And begin, like always, with your chain or single crochet in the first stitch. Okay, so I began my row with the chain one. In this one, I should now be working a puff stitch because in the prior row, here's my chain one and then my puff. So I need to work a puff stitch right here. So I'm going to come down to the 2 rows below, find that space between and work a puff stitch. Okay, so I completed my mini puff stitch. Now typically I would chain one and I would skip this puff stitch. But since we want to get rid of these holes, instead of chaining one, we're actually going to work into the top of that puff stitch, which is this little, well, you can see the top of the puff stitch right here. So you're just going to insert your hook and work a single crochet. Now you're going to drop down and work the puff stitch in that chain space, just like you would as if you had chained one. So mini puff into that space, complete the puff stitch, and then work a single crochet into this stitch right here. Now drop down and work your mini puff into that space. And then the next stitch over, you're going to single crochet. And then mini puff. So you're basically just replacing the chain one, skip one with an actual single crochet. All right, so mini puff, single crochet. As you can see, it's just kind of closing up that top section there. Another mini puff stitch and a single crochet, mini puff stitch, single crochet, mini puff stitch to end the row, and then a single crochet into the top of the last single crochet of the row. And as you can see, it has this nice clean edge.